Chapter 7. James the Magician. Mandy couldn't wait to tell Amy her idea. She rushed to the Fentons' house right after leaving Hobart's Corner. Amy was still in the garden. She was playing with Minnie, letting the little mouse run up and down her arm. "I think she's feeling very left out," Mrs. Fenton said as she and Mandy watched Amy from the kitchen window. "Just wait till I tell her my idea, Mrs. Fenton," Mandy said. "She'll feel better then, you'll see." Mrs. Fenton looked at her in surprise. "What idea?" she said. Mandy smiled. "We found a way to include Minnie in the play," she said to Amy's mother. "Minnie?" said Mrs. Fenton. "But that would be wonderful." Then she smiled. "Come on," she said. "Think Amy should hear this first. Let's go and tell her." Mandy ran out into the garden with Mrs. Fenton following behind her. Amy looked up, but she didn't smile. She was still really sad. "Amy," said Mandy, "I've got a great surprise for you. Guess what? We thought of a way to have Minnie in the play." For a moment, Amy didn't understand. "Minnie?" she said. "What do you mean?" Mandy sat down on the grass beside Amy and started to explain the plan. Gradually, Amy's face cleared and lit up with excitement as she listened. "That's terrific," she said when Mandy had finished. She looked down at Minnie, curled in her lap. "Do you hear that, Minnie?" she said. "You're going to be in the play. You're going to be a star." Mandy grinned at Amy. "So can you come to Hobart's Corner tomorrow?" she said. She turned to Mrs. Fenton. "James is going to practice his tricks, and Mr. Spleeny needs to see Minnie. We need a little box for her for the trick." "I'll bring Amy over," Mrs. Fenton said. She looked at Amy and laughed. "I don't think I could stop her. I think she would hop all the way to Hobart's Corner if she had to." Mandy smiled. Everything was working out. James really did look like a wizard the next evening at Hobart's Corner. The suns and moons on his cape glittered in the early evening light, and his pointy hat didn't fall off once during the whole practice. Underneath his cloak he had a white shirt with billowing sleeves, black trousers, and black shiny boots. What a wizard! The garden at Hobart's Corner was filled with people. Mr. and Mrs. Gardner were there, plus the Hunters, Grandma and Grandpa, Amy, Mandy, Jack, and Blackie, and of course James, Mr. Spleeny, and Minnie. Mr. Spleeny's doves were perched in the apple tree. James gave a great performance. First, he did the trick with the ping-pong ball, making it disappear right in front of Grandma's eyes. "Well, I never," said Grandma. "How did you do that?" Then he got Grandpa to tear up a sheet of newspaper and place it in a wooden box. James tapped the box 3 times with his wand, then opened it, and there was a whole sheet of newspaper. Grandpa laughed. "Honestly," he said, "I watched every move you made, and I can't figure out how you did that." "It's magic," James said, taking a pack of cards from his pocket. "Now I'm going to do a card trick." He asked Mandy to pick a card and put it back in the pack. Then he shuffled the cards and picked out Mandy's card. "How did you know which card I picked?" she said. James looked mysterious. "I can't tell you that," he said. "I'm sworn to secrecy." Mr. Spleeny nodded. "It wouldn't be magic if everyone could do it," he said. Mandy smiled. James was so excited, his glasses kept sliding down his nose. He bit his lip in concentration, swirled around in his long black cloak, and produced a bunch of flowers from nowhere. He presented the flowers to Mrs. Gardner. "Oh, I wish I could grow flowers as easily as that," Grandma said, and everybody laughed. "Do a trick for me," said Jack. James fanned the pack of cards, got Jack to pick a card and put it back, then threw the pack up in the air. James watched the cards fluttering down to earth, but Mandy has seen this trick before. She watched James. He took off his hat, tapped it with his magic wand, and Jack's card fell out. "Wow!" said Jack. "Bravo!" Mrs. Gardner shouted as James pulled a string of scarves from behind his left ear and gave a final bow. Mandy clapped loudly. "Your cloak looks great, Grandma," she said. "And your hat looks great, too," said Grandma. Mandy was pleased. She had worked hard on that pointy hat. Everybody clapped enthusiastically. Blackie ran around the garden, barking his head off. Then he came and leaped out on James, pawing at his cloak. The Labrador caught hold of something and tugged. It was a colored flag. "Blackie, no, bad boy!" James shouted as Blackie tugged harder. Then Blackie was off across the garden with a long trail of colored flags flapping behind him. Mr. Spleeny's doves fluttered higher up into the apple tree. "I believe that's the end of the performance," Grandpa said, laughing. James raced after Blackie, his cloak fluttering in the breeze. His hat fell off as he ran. Mr. Spleeny picked it up and looked at it thoughtfully. Then he went over to his trunk and brought out a little box covered in silver paper. He turned to Amy. "May I see Minnie?" he said. Amy took Minnie out of her cage and handed her to Mr. Spleeny. Mr. Spleeny took the little mouse carefully in his hands, clucking to her softly. Minnie twitched her whiskers. Then Mr. Spleeny hummed and rocked Minnie slowly in his hands. She blinked a few times and closed her eyes. Mandy and Amy watched with open mouths as Mr. Spleeny put Minnie gently into the silver box. "Perfect," he said. "I hoped I would have something in my trunk that would do." "You put her to sleep?" Amy said, her eyes wide. "How did you do that?" Mr. Spleeny looked at her and smiled. Mandy laughed. "Don't tell us. Magic," she said as James came back with the colored flags bunched in his hands. "Sorry about that," he said, panting from the chase with Blackie. Mr. Spleeny had his head in the trunk again. He brought out a thing that looked like a big black paper clip. "Just what I need," he said. Mandy peeked into the trunk. It was full of weird-shaped objects and mirrors and boxes. "Now, James," said Mr. Spleeny, "give me your hat and we'll start practicing the mouse trick. I've thought of a way to do it." Amy looked at the magician. "Minnie will be safe?" she asked nervously. Mr. Spleeny stretched out a hand, and at once a white dove swooped down from the apple tree and settled on his shoulder. "It's Bianca," Mandy said softly. Mr. Spleeny tipped the dove gently onto Amy's shoulder. Bianca fluttered her feathers slightly, then found her balance. She settled close to Amy's neck and made a soft, bubbly sound deep in her throat. "Oh, that's nice," said Amy, delighted. Mr. Spleeny smiled. "You take care of Bianca, and I'll take care of Minnie," he said. "Is it a deal?" Amy stretched up a hand and stroked Bianca's feathers. "It's a deal," she said. Mr. Spleeny looked thoughtful. "You know, James," he said, "I know you've got an apprentice, but every magician should have a proper assistant. What do you think? Would you like an assistant?" James looked at Amy, then he grinned at Mr. Spleeny. "I think an assistant would be a great idea," he said. Amy looked up at Mr. Spleeny. Her face broke into a wide smile. "You mean me?" she said. "You would feel better if you were James's assistant for the mouse trick," Mr. Spleeny said. "Then you could be sure that Minnie was all right." "What would I have to do?" asked Amy. "Just stand behind James," said Mr. Spleeny. "Of course you would need a costume." "A costume?" said Amy. "I love a costume, but there isn't time, is there?" Mandy put her head to one side. "We could ask Grandma," she said. "She finished making my tunic for the play last night." "Would she do it?" Amy asked. "Why don't you go and see?" Mr. Spleeny said. "James and I have work to do." "Oh, can't we stay and watch?" said Mandy. But Mr. Spleeny shook his head. "I know, magic secrets," Mandy said, but she didn't really mind. "I want to go and ask about my costume," said Amy, pulling Mandy across the grass toward the house. Mandy laughed. "You can hobble pretty fast when you want to, Amy," she said. Amy turned a shining face to her. "I'm so excited," she said. "I really thought Minnie and I were going to have to be left out. Isn't this great?" Mandy nodded. "Just wait and see what Grandma comes up with for a costume," she said. "That'll be great, too." As they walked across the garden toward the house, Mandy looked back. James and Mr. Spleeny were bent over the pointy hat, examining it closely. What were they up to? She wondered.